Well, hey everyone, welcome to Cannabis Technology, and with me today is Dr. Douglas Jorgensen, CEO of New England Sport and Spine. How you doing today, Doug?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I'll give our listeners a quick bio. Douglas is a triple board certified physician. He's pioneered and contributed to many boards and received too many accolades to list. Basically, Douglas's background is in family medicine, neuromuscular skeletal medicine, and osteopathic manipulative medicine, and pain medicine. He's been at it for quite a few years, had his own radio show. As I said earlier, he's the owner of New England Sport and Spine. And the purpose of this call is to learn a little bit about Douglas, his seasoned past in osteopathic manipulative medicine, and we're interested in chatting to enhance the public's understanding of the role of cannabis as it relates to osteopathic medicine. So, Douglas, I thought we'd start kind of high level. Let's talk a bit about pharmaceutical grade cannabis products, how one can achieve those, and how did we get there? How did we get to this point?
Sure. So we've had legalization in Maine since, I think, 2007. I was never one who was opposed to the utilization a lot of our MS patients and cancer patients were using, and we had always had Marinol, which is a synthetic cannabis product that had been available and is still available, that was very helpful. And the conundrum was the federal illegality and our DEA licenses and trying to take care of folks. And so as we began looking at the emerging data, the Journal of the American Medical Association had a 2014 article showing a nearly 25% reduction in heroin and opioid overdose deaths in cannabis legal states. And then we began seeing drug substitution data in a landmark study that was based on Medicare data that was ironically done by a Canadian couple because our government didn't release this data in a study that showed cost savings exceeding $162 million on average per legal cannabis state in the U.S. And that number at this point is probably climbing north of $200 million in just drug savings to the Medicare program. So what we began noticing was that people needed a substitution methodology to have an effective change, what we would call an efficacious change, in moving from a controlled substance or other prescription drug to use a cannabis-based product. The intention at that point, and I'll stop there just to see if there's any questions about what I just said.
No, please keep going. It's all very interesting.
So that led me to kind of further research what was happening here, and we began seeing patients who were doing drug substitutions. The most compelling one I remember, and this was probably 10 years ago, I had a woman who was taking nighttime OxyContin for intractable pain. And at that time, we were doing a fair amount of risk mitigation work, so urine drug testing, pill counts, and such, and she didn't want to be subjected to them any longer and had asked me about cannabis. And I was relatively new to it, people even being exposed to it at that point. And I said, well, you can take that, but since we at that point were not letting people use medical cannabis in our practice, I said, you're going to have to decide between that or the oxycodone. And within a matter, and I helped her wean down, and we did a substitution. Within a matter of 3 weeks, she was only using cannabis. She was vaping at that point and was able to completely come off of her oxycodone. The variability and the need for the dosing is what I found the most frustrating, because very, very well-intentioned, very very well-run dispensaries and caregiver programs are doing their level best to give a consistent, replicable pharmaceutical-type product. The problem is, and I believe you had a program on micropropagation and plant tissue culture a little while back, if you don't have plant tissue culture so that the mother plant's genome is genetically identically replicated, then the characteristics and the features that you're looking for the CBD to THC ratios, the terpene and terpenoid profiles, and the milligrams per kilogram that product is supposed to be producing in the end product that the patient or the recreational consumer is taking, you don't really know what you're getting. And when you're working with neuroreceptors, if you're dealing with seizures, if you're dealing with pain, if you're dealing with PTSD or anxiety, you need to have an exactitude of dosing that is a very small margin of error, like we would expect when you go to a pharmacy to get a prescription. And the only way that can be achieved is by using a plant tissue culture-based program, because once you're out 3 or 4 generations, that's when you begin potentially developing hermaphrodites. You begin having genomic changes that will change the characteristics and features of the very product that you're taking, that you're hoping will be replicable and medicinal.
Gotcha. And this appears to be a reoccurring theme, is the lack of research, the lack of data, the lack of understanding of what we're actually taking.
Yes.
We're kind of behind the 8 ball. We know that the potential is there, but it's so hard to qualify its profile. Are you optimistic as time goes on that'll change?
I am optimistic. I mean, we're coming through a period of time where we have just been watching walls come down in areas that have been happening more rapidly, say for the feds, more rapidly than people would have anticipated. And we're even beginning to get some queries from some private insurance companies that want in on the savings that Medicare is seeing. And we've even had some prison systems that have made some inquiries as well. And so it's been a very interesting progress to watch. But the replicability piece and the consistency piece are out there. So I am optimistic that it's going to get better. But when I have been kind of disheartened a little bit is when I've gone to talk to some dispensaries, when I've gone to work with some growers, they just feel like we're selling a lot of product. We're not really interested in changing our cloning methodologies, or they think that because they have someone who is, a experienced cannabis consumer, or as one of my friends like to call them, an experienced enthusiast, they are able to accurately predict what that product is. And that would be like giving someone some pills and saying, these seem to be okay, we're going to put them on the pharmacy shelf now. And whether you're doing a recreational product or a medicinal product, you need to know, if I go out and have a martini and a couple of glasses of wine, I have a predictable expectation for what that is going to do to me. I should have that same level of expectation, and I should have that same amount of confidence when I'm using a cannabis-based product that is what's going to happen. And right now, there's just no way of knowing.
Absolutely. It's funny, I heard something very similar to that in a previous webcast we did with Matt Sampson, who was a grower, and talked about the drive and the needs out there to create these very specific niche products that he feels that there's a demand for, because he's a grower, but he's confronted by dispensaries that just want volume, most bang for buck. And
that's what's made them their money to date, and they've made a lot of money from it.
Yeah, I understand.
And I don't say that pejoratively. I really don't. It's a business, so I get it. But I think the mindset of the consumer, and as the consumer becomes more educated and understands that there is a difference between someone who is paying attention to how the end product is being produced to someone who's just creating as much as they can produce to fill their shelves and sell, I think the delta there is going to become very noticeable in pretty short order, because the science is real, the science is here, and as we begin doing drug substitution medically, you're going to have a demand from the medical community that we have a high level of specificity, and we want to know where we can get the drugs that have the specificity, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with a drug. If I do, 3 shots of Everclear, it's going to be a considerably different experience than if I do 3 shots of vodka. And if I am taking a cannabinoid product that should be the equivalent of the 3 shots of vodka, and suddenly I get 3 shots of Everclear, I'm going to have a very different afternoon or evening. And that isn't something I want to guess at. And from a patient perspective, if you're taking this for seizures or anxiety, you're putting that person's health at risk. And I think that's both unconscionable and unethical, and we have a means to make that not happen anymore, and that's what we need to be focusing on.
Absolutely. And this is what we're dealing quite often in pain management. So all the
Right.
more reason.
Right.
Different animals. Let's go on to CBD1 and CBD2 receptors. Chat a
Sure.
bit about how they work with THC and CBD respectively.
So there was a pretty long held belief that the CBD1 receptors were exclusively THC in terms of their response, and they're in the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord predominantly is what you'd think about there. And then the CBD2 receptors are thought to be primarily inflammatory, immunologic, and they were purely in the peripheral area. What the literature has come to show us is that there is an endocrine function, so endocrine being your pituitary gland, your hypothalamus, your adrenals, things that run the hormonal systems in our bodies, and that the CBD2 receptors actually have a neuroendocrine activity from the CBD itself within the cannabis products, and that some of the THC is not just for euphoria, but it actually has some medical benefit to it as well. Well, I've had patients who were getting quote-unquote pure CBD products who took their medicine, and again, this speaks to what we were just discussing about the pharmaceutical grade product, and it was the same dispensary, the same product. They went home and they took it, and they were suddenly stoned, or could tell that they were getting high and they didn't want to be. And what they thought was, well, someone must have screwed up. They must have put some THC into this product, or they messed something up. And part of that, I think, is the cloning issue, because it wasn't the exact replicable product. But there's also a genetic issue that is occurring. And several years back, we were doing a fair amount of genomic testing, which means we were doing genetic analysis of patients, and everyone's DNA is unique. And when we went through and did that analysis, we could look at the metabolization of drugs, looking at the most popular one's known as the Cytochrome P450 system. And there are different types of enzymes that someone has. Some people have more, some people have less. And it can make you metabolize drugs differently, whether it's pain medicine, whether it's antidepressants, whether it's benzodiazepines, whether it's alcohol. And as you look at them, you saw people who were normal metabolizers, slow metabolizers, rapid metabolizers, or maybe even ultra-rapid metabolizers. So they would take those drugs in differently. Well, the same thing's going to happen in the endocannabinoid system. And the endocannabinoid system utilizes the CB1 and the CBD2 receptors. When you inhale something, that goes to the brain more rapidly because cannabis is what's known as lipophilic, lipid being a fat. The brain is mostly fat, so it is that lipophilic, philic meaning like, so it likes fat. It goes to the brain very, very rapidly because it bypasses the gastrointestinal system. When you have to go through the gastrointestinal system, the genome, the genetic differences, the intricacies for each individual predicates how that drug is going to affect that person. And for some people, their genetic makeup has a backdoor on the CBD1 receptor. So that person that got high or got euphoric when what they thought was a pure CBD product, it may not have been a THC issue. Could have been, but may not have been, because on the back of the CBD1 receptors are gates and ion channels that the CBD can activate, and you will develop a THC-like effect from someone taking pure CBD, because the CBD1 receptor, which is thought to just be THC, now we have found can be activated by cannabidiol and doesn't need to be just tetrahydrocannabis. And that I think is an important distinction, because it may be that the dispensary or the caregiver or whoever was your source for that product had more THC than they were supposed to, but it simply may be that genetically you're more susceptible because your body has those ion channels more active because of the genetic predisposition of the individual.
That's so fascinating, because that has happened to a friend of mine who, I've used CBD oils. They have certainly a calming effect on me. And she's been preached to many times and tried some CBD oil. And she really had a crazy reaction. She was kind of put off by it. She didn't expect it. I'm curious, was she, in a sense, was she impaired, or is that different from euphoria? Is there?
It depends. I mean, that's the difference. No, it's a very fair question, and I think that it's a subjective experience. So I don't like being out of control in my body. So my college days of drinking are not what they are nowadays, thank God. So when I look at even cannabis utilization, and I don't consume. I've probably used cannabis 10 times in my entire life. Not to sound like Bill Clinton, but I didn't inhale because I didn't understand what I was supposed to be trying to do because I don't smoke cigarettes. And so when I have tried it, I did notice how it was affecting me. I had a terpene experience using an oral tablet because I was trying to use something for some sleep because I had some stressful things going on, and I didn't want to take benzodiazepines. I didn't want to take other conventional pharmaceuticals, so I wanted to try a more natural component. And I took a terpene, and it put me over the top in terms of anxiety, and I had a panic attack, and it was very, very frightening. And there is a tolerance that will be built up in many, many people. So you'll see chronic cannabis users who are using far more than a cannabis naive person would use or should use. And so that euphoria and kind of that feeling that your friend experienced, that's a fine line between being too euphoric or too high to the point that now I'm really uncomfortable, I'm really not liking how my body is feeling, and I don't like the lack of control. And again, it's purely subjective. It could be subjective based upon the type of product or the source of the product and or combined with that person's genetics. And that is the part that is a variable that people are just having to kind of figure out. But the lack of specificity of the product means we have one more variable that we shouldn't have. So I think we're going to get to a point where you can precisely get a 2 or a 2.5 milligram, and then it goes up by 2 or 2.5 milligram increments so that people will know what it is they are getting, whether it's a chocolate, whether it's a candy, whether it's a vape pen, so that you know precisely how much you are taking, and then that will remove that particular variable out, and the only variable you'll have to learn is your own genetics, which is purely experiential, unless people want to pay for the genetic testing to try to identify that.
Okay. Do you think as research and data, as the floodgates kind of open to understanding the plant, one of the things that's really big is the entourage effect. It's not just one cannabinoid, it's a combination of several. Mm-hmm. And then there's the layer on top of that. How do everyone reacts differently? Do you think there will reach a point where we'll be able to quantify exactly, we can not just the milligrams of this, but the ability to calculate the entourage will be part of the package? Do you follow my question?
I do, and I think that when you're combining different terpenes and terpenoids, and we have at one of the companies that I'm the CEO of and I have ownership in, it's called CG Biogenomics, and at CG Bio we have the capacity to actually do genetic mutations. We did actually the first double allele combination of 2 mother plants, and we can blend and enhance the terpene, terpenoid, or the THC, CBD components depending upon which strains we want to combine, and we can basically create a new genome. So that entourage effect can be mitigated if the science behind it allows you to be able to predict which of the elements you're going to accentuate and which of the elements you're going to suppress. And that is up to the person making the genome, obviously, before it grows into the cultivar that becomes the drug. And that is the science that I think is so cool that will allow us to create very, very specific strains for specific disease states, but also for specific recreational experiences, depending upon what people like or don't like. Because not everybody, everything's different. That's just human nature. Everybody wants different experiences, and people respond differently to different drugs. That's why, people call it the art and science of medicine. I understand the science, but the art is learning how to take that science and implement it. And I don't think the cannabis medical world is, or even the recreational world for that matter, is going to be a lot different.
Okay. Could you educate me, Doug, on the substitution from pain medicines to it's pronounced benzodiazepines? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, benzodiazepines. Yes, sir. So the biggest issue, no one ever dies from withdrawal from pain medicine. You'll feel like you're going to die because you'll be retching and you'll have shakes and your body will be yelling because it doesn't have the medicine that it wants. But you don't ever die from withdrawing from pain medicine. Benzodiazepines withdrawal are like alcohol withdrawal. You can seize, and that's a potentially life-threatening event. So it's not something that I suggest people do lightly or on their own. It should be done under medical supervision. And we can wean people down while we're letting them use the cannabis products so that we can get them off of their medicine. And it can be done, depending upon how high a dose you're on, relatively quickly. And the majority of people who are on benzodiazepines are on them for anxiety or stress. And to your point, if you've got a CBD product that you've found that works well, it has that calming effect, but it doesn't have the secondary, I got to have more, I got to need more, that some of the benzodiazepine classes have. There's a particular drug called Alprazolam that I personally never prescribe and never have prescribed because it creates a jonesing and it creates a need as soon as it's gone, and there's a very short half-life, that as soon as it's out of your system, boom, you need another one. And they make a long-acting product like that, and that I have prescribed. But the short-acting one is terrible. The nice thing about the cannabis-based products is that typically doesn't happen. And you can help them have a prolonged benefit without having that desire or what people refer to as an addictive behavior, because the body becomes physically dependent on the drug and it begins saying, hey, I need more. And it begins to yell to you. Typically, that does not happen with cannabis, and that's why I think it's a nice drug substitution. And I've done a fair amount of DEA, FBI, and Department of Justice expert witness work on overdose cases around the country, and in all of the deaths, I say nearly all. I should say, because I never would say all or never. You're not supposed to ever do that, but nearly every single one of the deaths involved benzodiazepines plus heroin, benzodiazepines plus opioids, benzodiazepines plus alcohol plus opioids and heroin. It was never typically just heroin, just pain medicine. And benzos have been used for years, and it's one of the least regulated drugs when you look at recommendations for risk mitigation to keep a practice safe or to keep a community safe so that you're doing drug testing, pill counts, opioid agreements, controlled substance agreements. People don't think about benzos. And benzos, in my opinion, are one of the most dangerous drugs prescribed in the country.
Okay. I have a side question.
And cannabis is one of the best substitutions. So.
Yeah, and that's what I'm learning. And you know, there's this notion out there in the stratosphere that cannabis could be a gateway drug to other things. And I don't know if it was Hopkins University or it was Pew Research, but there is some hard data that's been done on the addictive or the gateway quality to drugs. And when cannabis was compared to opiates and alcohol, and it scored near the bottom in terms of, and almost, you know, is that just disinformation? Why? I'm curious.
Well,
has that been
this goes back to the whole war on drugs thing, right? So let's find something we think is bad and continue to promote evil concepts about it. And when we look at the data on the notion that it's a gateway drug, one of the most important factors in looking at any drug, whether it's alcohol, whether it's pills, whether it's cannabis, is the age at which the person started using and their family history and their personal history. You have to look at a risk stratification. So when I was in college, on the third floor of my fraternity, I probably could have gotten just about anything I wanted for drugs. I chose not to do them because I had a family history of polysubstance abuse, and I didn't want to know if I liked something because I just didn't want to find out. So I drank, and I probably drank a lot in college. But I chose not to try anything, including cannabis. I don't think I even tried cannabis until I was in my 30s. And the reason for it was I was genuinely fearful that I would have an addiction issue that I didn't want to know about. And what the science has said is that if you have a youngster, I just had this conversation with my niece and her mom last week, that she said, well, if cannabis is safer than alcohol, why can't I try cannabis? And she's 15. And what we explained to her is because when your brain is developing, we do have good evidence that brains that are exposed to controlled substances, particularly some of these theoretically illicit controlled substances, cannabis, heroin, any other types of hallucinogenics, or even a chronic utilization of pain medicine that is recreational, there is a definite increase in the risk, and that person has a higher risk factor for developing a substance use disorder problem down the road because something happens in their brain chemistry because they are still in a developing brain. Once you have an adult brain and that brain is mostly developed, that same level of risk, that same exposure, should not have a predictive effect on whether that person is going to have an issue down the road. That is what the majority of that literature is speaking to. Now, that has been taken and bastardized into saying, see, it's a gateway drug for everyone. And that's just not true. It's a gateway drug if it's used at too young an age. So one of my partners has a great program they started called Teens Know Better. And the objective is to get the young people in this country to understand, listen, there are things that you get to do as an adult that you don't get to do as a kid, and there are choices that you get to make as an adult that you don't get to make as a kid. And that is no different in the cannabis world than it should be any place else, because unless it's being used under medical supervision, kids who are in a developing age, particularly teenagers, anyone even from 10 to 20, really need to be cogently aware and cognizant of the fact that if you're going to try this, you have a potentially increased risk of an addiction issue down the road because of your brain being in a developing level right now. And parents need to understand that also. It's a frustrating thing for people to hear. But I also have kids who I've met who have been using cannabis medically. It's gotten them off of benzodiazepines. It's gotten them off of antidepressants, and they're living very functional lives. So it's not, as I said earlier, always and never are bad words to use, but that is where the gateway theory comes from. And that portion of it, from a teenage developing brain using a drug too early, I 100% agree with it.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So, Douglas, let's transition or segue to you. You're the owner, the CEO of New England Sport and Spine. I know you're not practicing, but it appears that you're involved with other businesses on this front. You made mention of one. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I actually got involved in this as a medical consultant, excuse me, and still had patients. I saw patients be successful with it. I had patients who were utilizing it, and I was able to get people completely off of controlled substances by using medical cannabis. I also was very fortunate that a colleague of mine, literally across the town, is a gentleman you may have heard by the name of Dustin Sulak, who's also an osteopath. He and I went to the same residency here. It's a Dartmouth-based family practice program. Very open-minded about their philosophies and what they were willing to try, and he came in very knowledgeable. And so Dustin was a resource that I leaned on pretty heavily. And he opened up one of the first cannabis medical practices in the state and was very, very successful. So we had some patients that we shared, and I also got to learn from him. And so when they called me and asked me about this company, I was skeptical, but I said, yeah, I'm willing to help you. And I began looking at what they were doing, and we have 2 patent pending products, one for pain, one for cancer. And the really interesting thing was to watch these patients who were coming back from Memorial Sloan Kettering, coming back from Duke, coming back from Dana-Farber, being told you're going to go home and die. And we were able to put them on our products. And I'm not making a cancer or pain claim because I don't want to get the FDA mad, but these are anecdotal statements. They came back, and several of them, their cancer went into complete remission. And I was kind of having a whiskey tango foxtrot moment going, how did that happen? How could this possibly be doing that? So that caused me to start doing more research. And I spoke to the doctors at Duke. I spoke to the doctors at Harvard. And I'm like, listen, was this a misdiagnosis? Did this person actually have what you're telling me they had? And they're like, no, they really did. And from glioblastoma multiforme, which is a horrific brain tumor, to prostate cancers, to different types of pulmonary cancer. And it was really an amazing thing to watch. So that got me more and more interested, and eventually the board said, we'd like you to run the company, and now that's led to us having some really interesting and intriguing opportunities to really change the field of cannabis medicine, and also to create what I think will be some very fun and exciting recreational products, because I look at the recreational market or the adult use market, as many people like to call it. I look at that as the same type of market because it is, when you're consuming an alcohol product, you have to know the dose, you have to know the prescription, otherwise you shouldn't be taking that either. And I think we have a responsibility to, if we have the genetics and the genetic capabilities to make that product safer, to do so. And so that's another market that we're working in.
Very cool, Doug. I really appreciate that. This has been an excellent
Sure.
conversation. I want to thank you for sharing your vast wealth of knowledge on this front. Before we wind up, can we leave our listeners with some places to visit if they want to learn more about you, but also more about the subject matter we just spoke of regarding osteopathic medicine and cannabis?
Sure. And that's actually kind of an interesting segue in itself. We are trying to put together some more information that has data on those particular topics. So what our New England Sport and Spine website has a lot of different alternative medicine and different elements. I mean, you're talking about ligament and tendon injuries. We've been doing regenerative medicine for 20 years, platelet-rich plasma, prolotherapy, et cetera. And we have some pieces on there, but we're going to be having our CG Bio website will be coming online very, very soon. We've been kind of hush-hush about this, one, because some of our technology, we wanted to make sure that it was protected, and because the intellectual property piece is pretty huge right now in the cannabis world. But the CG Biogenomics, CG, just the letters, and Biogenomics, BIOGENOMICS.com. That website will be out very soon, and there'll be a lot of information on there about what we do. We're beginning to enter in some exclusive and semi-exclusive contracts in some of the states for tissue culture, and we're working on some really exciting programs in the medical marketplace in the European Union and in Jamaica. So we're hoping we'll be able to have our products available very soon in some really accessible and very helpful places.
Fantastic. Dr. Jorgensen, I really appreciate it. You have a fabulous day, okay?
Thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate you having me on the show. It was a lot of fun.
That's it, everyone. See you next time.